The paper is called Rents, Violence and Access, BEE and South Africa's Transition to Democracy. It's done with a colleague who appeared in my study one day and said he wants to do a PhD with me. He's got an interesting background. He came out of business and had got involved in consulting around BEE and got extremely confused about what he was meant to be doing. And in many ways, the paper comes from his quest to work out what on earth we mean by BEE. If you look at BEE, generally we tend to think of BEE as being a set of policies and practices introduced after 1994, which ostensibly advance the interests of people who were excluded under apartheid. But I think generally we find that BEE has come to have a multiple set of meanings. At the extremes, people say it's a necessary instrument for racial redress. On the other hand, we get BEE dismissed as simply an instrument of crony capitalism. But whatever we think about BEE, I don't think there's any doubt that, I don't think many people would doubt that it is very important. It is continuously referred to as a touchstone of government policy, and business has to take some sort of notice of it. We use the NWW framework to develop what we think is a plausible diagnosis of BEE, and we ask whether, instead of becoming a force for change, it's actually become an instrument of macroeconomic policy and stabilisation. We also propose in the paper that if we look back at BEE, it actually comprises two streams of policy. One is BEE comes out of a whole set of reform initiatives of the late apartheid era, which induced the ANC leadership into various leadership structures. The second stream comes from inside the ANC and from inside the black business community, which is directed more proactively at using state power to facilitate black economic opportunity. But we argue that both approaches have developed as vehicles for the redistribution of rents. We have 5 sections in the paper. One, we just outline the limited access order model. Secondly, we illustrate the difficulties in defining, pinning BEE down. Thirdly, we outline the evolution of BEE. Fourth, we use the model to explore the evolution of the two streams of BEE, and then we just look at the value of the model. Just the first thing, just quickly going back to NWW. They argue that modern polities emerge when leaders shun violence in exchange for access to rents. They come to some sort of agreements. Human society, NWW argue, has gone through 3 broad stages. First of all, the foraging stage, hunter-gathering. Secondly, the long sweep of history, which they regard as the natural state, which has various phases, but essentially it's where personal relationships among powerful individuals who use violence to, there are personal relationships between powerful individuals who use violence to restrict the ability of the less powerful to gain access to rents. The open access order is where individuals and citizens interact with no need to be cognizant of the identity of their partners. In other words, this is a process of institutionalization. I broadly see the whole NWW framework being something of a transition as it goes through from basically Hobbes to Weber. If we look at the transition from the natural state to open access order, it's basically involves something of a social revolution to ensure the greater participation by citizens to secure impersonal political rights. So basically, I think NWW see history as involving the process of institutionalization, where elites see to have more to gain by opening up institutions to citizens rather than continuing to maintain the situation by violence. However, we argue that South Africa is not an open access order. It is still what NWW regard as a mature natural state. So, I'll move on to the whole business of defining BEE. Few decisions in South Africa are made without some reference to BEE. Whenever you sit in the committee room, there's often talk about equity and whatever and so forth. It's about racial redress, diluting white ownership and control and so forth. But whereas in practice BEE has become associated with, but actually in practice we think many people regard BEE as simply having associated with the development of the black business class. At the end of the day, I don't think there's any one definition of BEE. We argue that there's actually an uncoordinated set of policies which all claim to be implementing BEE. We trace something of the development of a generic conception of BEE, but we argue that this in practice comes to be generally conflated with specific policies of BEE. And in particular, this happened between 1998, which was the establishment of a Black Economic Empowerment Commission, which actually came through the whole set of recommendations which suggested BEE should be a wide-stream set of coordinated set of policies, which have the implication of the Commission review was that it would have a very fundamental impact upon macroeconomic policy. But actually we also argue that in practice, this wide conception of what black economic empowerment should be fell victim to the institutional framework of government. Basically, it got handed over initially to the Department of Trade and Industry, which kept the rhetoric, but in fact reduced the framework to a set of particular details. Here was we see first of all figure one, sorry, I don't think that's going to work, it's only got one. Yeah, okay. Basically, we here see the conception of the broadly put forward by the BEE Commission, suggesting a whole set of integrated policies. Unfortunately, the second half of the diagram, which argues how, in fact, a set of specific models have been imposed which destroy the integration. If we look at the definition which came out of the Broad-Based Economic Development Act of 2003, I'm just going to read it to you. Broad-based black economic empowerment is the economic empowerment of all black people, including women, workers, youth, people with disabilities, and people living in rural areas through diverse but integrated socio-economic strategies that include, but are not limited to, increasing the number of people that manage, own and control enterprises and productive assets, facilitating ownership and management of enterprises and productive assets by communities, workers, co-ops and collective enterprises, human resources and skills development, achieving equitable representation in all occupational categories and levels in the workforce, preferential procurement and investment in enterprises that are owned or managed by black people. In fact, the grandeur of the definition has not been matched in practice. You find that the policy overall is housed within the DTI, but the DTI has no direct authority over the various matters referred to, which are all split between different ministers. For instance, issues of women, youth, etc. are in that department with a very long name. Land problems are land issues, obviously in the Department of Agriculture and Land, again, whatever they exactly mean. Mining and liquids in the Department of Minerals and so on, Department of Mining. And then there is an obvious conflict between the DTI, which is supposedly in charge of black economic empowerment, and the Department of Finance, which is notionally responsible for the economic empowerment of the entire population, including that portion of it which is black. Now, so we're suggesting that the implementation of B there's been little substance in the reality. There's been little substance in delivering what the Broad-Based Economic Empowerment Act envisaged. There have been some successes, but on the whole, we would argue there have been many more failures. For instance, if we look at the whole land issue and the very limited success in the land redistribution and what you would call black economic empowerment there are notorious. Similarly, there is actually no comprehensive reporting mechanism about BE. There are various other measures, but the presidency comes up with measures, the Financial Mail comes up with measures, different departments come up with their measures, but there's no one coordinated set of measures which government uses. Many of the measures conflict, and so on. At the end of the day, if we're talking about black economic empowerment in that broad perspective of actually empowering the people who are excluded under apartheid, what have we got? Clearly, we've still got a very low rate of growth. We've got very modest increases in black incomes. We've got a continuation of massive racial inequality. We've still got high rates of unemployment. So one has to question what has happened to black economic empowerment. Let me go to the origins and development of BE. The origins in much of the writing we read describes the origins of BE to big business, but we argue that actually the origins are rather more diffuse than that. There have actually been many BE-style programs of a similar character which have developed since the 1970s. And many of them are echoed in what we have today. And I've just got a list of them which I can elaborate. But if we look at, for instance, go back, we've got a whole list of them, no particular order. The promotion of business within the Bantu styles. You go back to that framework, we have the Bantu Investment Corporation, we have the Transkei Development Corporation, etc., all involved in the process of supposedly building a black business class, and developing at that time, of course, regarded as a collaborative business class, a collaborative middle class within the Bantu styles. We had at that time, we had the establishment of a number of large business ventures by black business people. Talking, for instance, about the African Bank, which was created by NAFCOC, Black Like Me, as well. The funds for these early black business ventures were overwhelmingly raised from the black community. sometimes partnered by white institutions. On occasion, sometimes they also needed to have white partners who would front for them because of the oppressive legal atmosphere. Black Like Me was one of those, which needed a white partner so that it could escape some of the apartheid regulations. We had, more generally, the formation of a small but significant black business community. There was, of course, a trading community which operated within the, I prefer the Bantustans, but operated within the urban areas, which developed somewhat in the late 1980s as various of the restrictions were lifted, again operating in very ambiguous circumstances, because on the one hand, because they were operating in a very high-cost model, because they had limited access to goods to sell and so forth, they tended to charge higher prices, and they got accused of being in collaboration with white business. They suffered a lot of violence and so forth. We had at this time, we had the formation of the Black Management Forum, 1976. NAFTOP goes back to originally goes back to the early 1960s. We had at that time the South African Black Taxi Association. We had the development of FATCOS in the late 1980s. The various black business groups eventually came together to present what was called the Mapani Memo of Understanding to the ANC, or they signed that understanding with the ANC in 1993. We had the provision of assistance to black business by white corporations. This is perhaps the one of the most well-known aspects of the development of BE. The most advanced model was Anglo's Zimeli model, out of which, remember, one of the employees of that was, who was given a boost by Anglo Zimeli, was Patrice Mcebisi. Now, well, he was listed as the richest person in South Africa in 2011. I'm not quite sure whether he still is, but he's not short of a penny. We had the codes of conduct, funnily enough. Do you remember those things? The British Code of Conduct, the European Code of Conduct, the what was the American one? It's gone out of my head, but we had. Sorry?
Southall.
Yes, yeah. We had the Swedish Code and so on and so forth. Most of them were regarded by radicals, by the trade union movement, as facade operations, just to counter the anti-investment brigade. And on the whole, they were ignored and they failed. Nonetheless, we argue that they had an influence because if you go back and look at the codes, they're extremely similar to what you see in many of the codes of conduct today in some of government legislation. They also gave the notion of legitimacy to business. They gave legitimacy to the notion of enforcing some form of codes upon business. Controversially, and we had quite an argument about this, but anyway. But in terms of a broad conception of BE, we had the development and incorporation via VHARM of unions, which led to the incorporation of what at the time were called black urban insiders versus migrant outsiders and so forth. That's a little bit exaggerated. ANC, ready to government document, gave a certain amount of attention to BE. We had business contacts with the ANC and incentives throughout the 1980s to promote black upward mobility within their companies, perhaps prompted by shortage of white labour, but nonetheless it happened. We need to go back and look at that more carefully. And then there's also the post-1994 initiatives by the ANC. And broadly speaking, there have been a whole set of major empowerment policies. Not just the policies which come under the name of BE, but we get employment equity, we get skills empowerment acts, and so on and so forth. So basically we're arguing that there are these two streams of BE. First of all, the political reforms of the late apartheid era, which ultimately inspired BEE deals between large-scale capital and the need for large-scale capital to develop, to establish linkages with the ANC through various BE deals where they handed out shares and so forth. They needed, in that famous phrase, political connectivity. And then secondly, we have a set of policies formulated by the ANC, which, although designed to promote business, focus upon promoting betterment of non-elite groups via executive employment and so forth. So, move on to the evolution of BE within South Africa limited access order. In the limited access order, the polity is controlled by a dominant elite comprising powerful